Frame rate is really important when shooting video, and changing your frame rate matters a lot. It'll affect the look and the feel of your video. It'll affect whether it feels kind of cinematic and film-like, or whether it feels more sporty, or whether it feels more like a soap opera. There's lots of things that are affected, including slow motion and time lapses. It's a really integral part of shooting your video, and it can seem confusing at first, but actually it's pretty straightforward once you understand it. We're gonna get into it. We're gonna talk about how you set it up, why it's important, and exactly what you should do. So first of all, what is frame rate? Well, this is essentially the number of images per second that make up your video. So all of this video is just a number of still images per second playing one after the other, which after a certain point, after a certain speed of one image after another, start to look like actually a moving picture and start to look like a video. So this is shot at 25 frames per second. That means that my camera is capturing 25 still images every second and then playing them back at that same speed, 25 images every second. And because they are 25 every second, your eyes can't tell the difference between a bunch of still images and then this video. It just looks like movement and video to your eye. Why am I shooting at 25 frames a second? Well, ultimately because that's the pretty standard frame rate that you'll be used to for normal speed motion. Now, this differs a little bit around the world. 25 frames a second is pretty normal here in Europe. 24 frames a second is pretty normal for films. It's actually ever so slightly less than 24 frames a second, but we're gonna call it 24 frames a second to make it easier. 30 frames a second can be pretty standard and pretty normal for certain types of content. And actually, there's a certain look that you get in soap operas, so let's say EastEnders or something like that, that you get a certain fluidity and smoothness to the footage, which is called the soap opera effect, because of the frame rate that it's shot at. And then you might shoot a higher frame rate for certain things like sports. So a lot of football or rugby is shot at 50 or 60 frames a second, again, depending on where you are in the world, because it gives it a smoother feel. There's more images per second, so all of the motion is smoother. There's literally just more images to fill out that time and make the motion feel smoother. Okay, so that's a very brief, overarching kind of explanation of frame rates. 25 frames a second, 24 frames a second, that's pretty standard as your kind of filmic look. Now, films are generally at 24 frames a second, which means that any content shot at about 24 frames a second, 25 also is probably fine, look a little bit more cinematic because it's what you're used to seeing when you watch films. Now, that's not necessarily something that you will automatically be able to pick up on, but your brain tells you this looks the same as the films we've seen because it's at the same frame rate. Therefore, this feels more like a film. Therefore, it's more cinematic. Now, when you shoot at a faster frame rate, so let's say 50 frames a second, you can then play that back and that will be smoother than 25 frames a second, or you could play that back at half speed. Now, if you play 50 frames a second back at half speed, you'll be playing it at 25 frames a second, which is the same as this normal motion. But because it was shot at 50 frames a second, it's only moving half as fast, which means that it's now in slow motion. If you shot something at 100 frames a second and played it back at 25 frames a second, it's now taking you 4 seconds to get through each second of the footage that you filmed. So it's playing back at 25% speed. So really quite nice, smooth, slow motion. This is essentially how you get slow motion in your footage. You shoot at a higher frame rate and then play it back at a slower frame rate. Whenever you come to edit your footage, you will have a base frame rate or a project frame rate. And that is the frame rate. I feel like I'm saying frame rate about 1,000 times. That is the frame rate that indicates normal speed, normal motion. So for example, in this video, the normal standard project base frame rate is 25 frames a second. That means that 25 frames a second is the standard speed of footage. So this is shot in 25 frames a second. So when it's played back at 25 frames a second, it's normal speed. But this footage was shot at 100 frames a second, but it's being played back at the project frame rate of 25 frames a second, which means it's going much slower than it was shot at. Now I could do the opposite. I could shoot something much slower, so for example, 1 frame a second, and then play that back at the base frame rate, which is 25 frames a second, and it'll speed it up. This time lapse, for example, was shot much, much slower. It was 1 frame every 10 seconds. But when you play that back at 25 frames a second, it means that you have this time-lapse effect. You have it going much, much faster. It's a really important choice when you come to choose this, but if in doubt, I would always just stick to something like 24 or 25 frames a second, because it'll give you a really natural, somewhat cinematic feel to any footage that you have. And we're all very used to seeing that kind of frame rate when it comes to watching videos online, films, or really anything like that. Now, I think this is a really fascinating topic. There's lots of additional kind of wrinkles and interesting little things you can do to affect the look of your footage when it comes to actually changing that shutter speed or changing the frame rate or anything like that. So there's lots of different things you can do. This really is just the basics of what frame rate is and what it does and how you can affect it to affect the look of your footage. But if you have any questions, absolutely pop them down in the comments, because I really like talking about this stuff, so let me know down there. Of course, there's a full list of all the kit used for this video, for all the stuff in this video as well, so you can check them out all down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video as well. I will see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.